Hi guys, Kenna here. So today we're going to be looking at the process of cellular respiration. So far we've talked about those high energy molecules and then we kind of focused in on photosynthesis. So today we're going to go ahead and do the companion reaction to photosynthesis, cellular respiration. Let's take a look at our essential questions. Number one, what are the reactants and products of cellular respiration? Just like we looked at the reactants and products in photosynthesis, let's do the same with cellular respiration. Instead of two parts, we're dealing with three parts. So number two, what are the three parts of cellular respiration process and where do they take place? Number three, how is fermentation different from respiration? I'm going to join them together here in this presentation because they're very closely related and deal with how our body gets energy. And number four, what are the two types of fermentation and how are they different from each other? Now, most of you have done some sort of exercise at some point. Do you run, bike, swim? When you exercise, these are all good ways for you to take care of your body. But when you use the energy, when you do this exercise, your body also needs oxygen in order to get the energy out of your glucose, which remember is that supersugar C6H12O6. So take a minute and think about how your body feels right at the start of exercise, such as a long, slow run, not pushing yourself real hard, about a minute in. Okay, so give yourself time to loosen up a little bit. So about a minute into the run, how do you feel? Okay, most of you probably are thinking, "Yeah, I feel pretty good. I just started." Now, how do you feel about 10 minutes into that run? What is the change in your body that's causing the change in the way you feel? Now, number two, what do you think is happening in your cells to cause these changes in how you feel? So far, we've done exercise at what we call a slow pace, okay? Easing into it, but definitely starting to work into it. Now, think about the opposite. Think about going from a standstill to as fast as you possibly can for 100 meters. Could you keep up this pace for longer distance? For 200, 400 meters? Okay, 400 meters is a, quarter mile. What about 800 meters? That's the metric half mile. 1600? Four laps? What if you were trying to look at this sort of pace for 5 miles, 10 miles, or if you were trying to do the marathon? Could you keep up that pace? And how does your body feel as you go ahead and go through it? What's happening to your body as you continue to run at these fast paces for longer and longer distances? Well, that's one of the key things we want to go ahead and explore today as we go ahead and take a look at cellular respiration. So, this is dealing with cellular respiration. And cellular respiration is the process that releases the energy by breaking down the food molecules that we eat. And it does this in the presence of oxygen. So let's go ahead and look at the chemical and word formulas for cellular respiration, just like we did for photosynthesis. So if you did the cell respiration lab, which we're going to go ahead and start today, hopefully you recognize that the reactants and products are related between these two processes. So reactants, remember, are those at the beginning, and products are those at the end when we finish. We're going to go ahead and start with C6H12O6. Should look familiar to you. Do you guys remember what this molecule is? That's right. This is glucose. And we're going to go ahead and add to that glucose some oxygen. Yeah. So this is why you breathe, is to be able to go ahead and break down the food that you eat so that you can get the energy out of it to perform your living tasks. This is then going to go ahead and produce the products or end results of the chemical reaction. We're going to breathe out carbon dioxide, produce some water for our body, and give off the ATP energy. Okay. Notice that these are all the exact same pieces that we saw in photosynthesis, just reversed. So in this case, the reactants of cellular respiration were the products of photosynthesis, and the products of cellular respiration were the reactants of photosynthesis. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and take a look at the overview of cellular respiration. Now, there are three parts to cellular respiration. We've got glycolysis, this first one, and then we've got the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. Now, notice the label here of mitochondria. That's the singular for mitochondria. These two processes, the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, take place inside the mitochondria. The glycolysis process, however, does not. This one actually takes place in the cytoplasm. And this ends up being a key piece of information when we start thinking about the differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotes, remember, do not have membrane-bound organelles. They only have one membrane, and that's the outer cell membrane. So there are no mitochondria in prokaryotes. That being said, they can't do the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain, which require the mitochondria to take place. We start out with our glucose molecule here, which goes into glycolysis. We're going to break that in half. Remember, this is C6H12O6. And we're going to end up with a 3-carbon pyruvic acid, which is going to end up going into the Krebs cycle. That's only if we have oxygen present. If we don't have oxygen present, then it's going to go ahead and stay here in the cytoplasm and do the best it can. We're going to carry in some electrons as well for the electron transport chain here. And ultimately, our final goal is to go ahead and manufacture ATP, which is our ready-made energy source we've been talking about for walking, talking, thinking, blinking. Let's go ahead and take another look at this chemical pathway, looking a little bit more at those stages again. So here we go. We've got a glucose molecule. Remember, there are 6 carbons, so we can count them here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. That's going to go through glycolysis, which takes place where? That's right, in the cytoplasm, and it produces a little bit of ATP. Now your body has a choice to make. Does it have oxygen or does it not have oxygen? If it has oxygen, it's going to go into the mitochondria for these last 2 steps, the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. If not, it's going to stay out here in the cytoplasm and do fermentation, either alcoholic or lactic acid. We'll talk a little bit more about these later. This is where we see our products coming out, CO2 and H2O. But ultimately, the main goal of cellular respiration is to produce ATP for those life processes. So let's go ahead and start out with this first stage, which is glycolysis. So glycolysis is the process in which one molecule of glucose is broken in half, snap. Okay? This is going to produce 2 molecules of pyruvic acid, which is a 3-carbon compound. Now, it's a little more complicated than simply just breaking it in half. Remember, this is a ring when we think about glucose. And so it's pretty stable as is, but we have to go through some chemical reactions to break the glucose molecule into 2 pieces. The term glycolysis actually comes from the Greek word glucose, meaning sweet, and lysis, which is Latin for to break down. So our literal translation of glycolysis is to break down sweets, or in this case, our sugar glucose. Now remember that glycolysis does not require oxygen to happen. Okay? No oxygen is required, and it takes place inside the cytoplasm, not inside the mitochondria. Okay? So let's look at a quick overview of glycolysis. So in glycolysis, we're going to go ahead and actually use 2 ATP to go ahead and break apart the glucose molecule. That then is going to settle into a more stable form of pyruvic acid and produce 4 ATP and 2 NADH. Now, if we use 2 and make 4, that means we're going to go ahead and have a net, okay? We're going to have a net production of 2. So 4 produced minus the 2 that we use to get started here is going to equal 2 net. All right. So 2 net ATP. All right. So let's look at the reactants and products for this particular part of the cycle or part of the process. So glycolysis will use glucose and 2 ATP. Remember, the ATP are going to allow us to break that glucose molecule in half. And when it settles down into pyruvic acid to 3 carbon molecules, it produces 4 ATP, 2 NADH, and 2 pyruvic acid molecules. Okay. So I want to highlight this particular molecule right here, this pyruvic acid. And the reason is this is a very important intermediate. We break down the glucose, and this is the one that's going to go ahead and determine whether we complete cellular respiration or whether we go ahead and stay in the cytoplasm and complete fermentation. Now, before we go in the most optimal pathway and look at cellular respiration, let's go ahead and dive briefly into fermentation. Okay. So fermentation is a process that releases energy from food molecules in the absence of oxygen. So no oxygen is required here, no oxygen is present. Your body still does glycolysis because remember, glycolysis does not require oxygen to happen. But like glycolysis, fermentation stays in the cytoplasm. And there are 2 main types of fermentation: alcoholic fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. Let's start with alcoholic fermentation. Now, alcoholic fermentation is done by very few organisms. Yeast and a few other microorganisms use alcoholic fermentation to form ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide. So you start out with your pyruvic acid that we identified before, and then we're going to use some of that NADH we manufactured to produce alcohol, some carbon dioxide, and NAD plus so that we can continue going through the glycolysis process. This ethyl alcohol is what's found in beer, okay, and wine. This is the fermentation process that we use to make alcohol. It's also what we use to go ahead and manufacture bread. So you may be thinking to yourself, why don't we get drunk then, consuming a whole bunch of bread? And that's because the alcohol actually cooks out because of the temperature of the oven, but the little air pockets is what causes the bread to rise. Okay, so when we go ahead and take a look at this, the air pockets that are produced by the CO2 from the fermenting yeast will go ahead and cause the bread to rise. So it's really a good thing that we don't do alcoholic fermentation. Okay, because if we did, anytime you went to go ahead and exercise and needed more energy than you had available, your body would start producing alcohol. Yes, at the cellular level. And so essentially you'd kind of be getting drunk as you exercised. And there are certain individuals who have a rare disorder where their body does something similar to this. So they have to be careful about how much exercise they perform. But most organisms, including humans, actually do lactic acid fermentation. And so during rapid exercise, when your body can't get enough oxygen to the tissues to go through the normal pathway that goes through the mitochondria, we do some of this inside the cytoplasm, and the pyruvic acid goes through glycolysis and then stays there and goes through lactic acid fermentation. This is part of why your muscles feel sore after only a few seconds of intense exercise. Okay? That lactic acid actually can build up in the muscles and produce some soreness. When you first finish a really intense workout, the soreness that you feel immediately afterwards is due to the buildup of lactic acid. Okay? This lactic acid produces what we call muscle fatigue. Okay? Now, if you go longer than, say, 24 hours of soreness after your exercise, there's more going on than just lactic acid buildup. Okay? Because by that time, you've had enough breaths, you've brought in enough oxygen to convert the lactic acid back to the pyruvic acid and been able to go through the normal pathway and produce as much ATP as possible. We can actually go ahead and look at how short you are in terms of the oxygen needed to finish this process. And we call this oxygen debt. This is the amount of oxygen you would need to go ahead and convert your lactic acid back into pyruvic acid and then go through the normal process of cellular respiration. Okay. If you're sore for more than that original day, that this is not due to lactic acid, but is what they call DOMS, DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness. And what you're looking at here typically is micro tears in the muscle fibers. And this is important when we start thinking about building up new muscle. And you may have heard something about need to tear down before we can build up and that sort of thing. And if you talked about this in wellness, or if you go on to take IB Sports Exercise Health, you'll actually talk more in detail about how this muscle fatigue process works, how it relates to nutrition, oxygen, and the cellular respiration process. So let's look in a little more detail at the lactic acid process in terms of fermentation. Remember, we always start out with glycolysis. So you go through glycolysis and you use 2 ATP to go ahead and break the glucose molecule down into 2 pyruvic acid. If you do not have oxygen to go into the mitochondria, that pyruvic acid then is going to go into lactic acid fermentation. It's going to use those 2 NADH that we just manufactured along with our ATP to go ahead and convert the pyruvic acid into lactic acid. And then those NAD pluses go back to glycolysis to allow it to continue to use whatever sugars you have available. All right, so that's what happens if you don't have oxygen. But this is not the ideal situation, and we want to think about what your body does on a regular basis. Unless you're a really high-end athlete and pushing yourself to extremes often, you probably do a lot less lactic acid fermentation than you do traditional cellular respiration. If you do cellular respiration, we still do glycolysis, which takes place in the cytoplasm, but then those 2 pyruvic acid molecules are going to pass into the mitochondria, where we're going to perform the next step of this process, the Krebs cycle. So in the presence of oxygen, the pyruvic acid produced in glycolysis goes on to the Krebs cycle rather than stay in the cytoplasm to do lactic acid fermentation. During the Krebs cycle, pyruvic acid is broken down into carbon dioxide in a series of energy extracting reactions. Now, it's important to remember that when we're looking at energy storage in living systems, it's stored in the bonds, the chemical bonds. We started out with glucose, which was a 6-carbon sugar. Okay, so we have all those different bonds. And then we break it in half to produce a 3-carbon sugar. So we've extracted some of the energy out of it. Now we're going to go from 3-carbon sugar of pyruvic acid down to carbon dioxide, which has 1. No more bonds between the carbons. This is where we're going to get the majority of our energy that we use for producing ATP. Now, this is not the final stage, and we will go ahead and do more electron movement in the last part and capture even more ATP. There are 2 parts to the Krebs cycle. In the first part, the pyruvic acid is converted into citric acid. So you may have heard of citric acid as well. In the second part, the citric acid is then cycled to produce ATP, NADH, FADH2. And remember, we talked about NADPH when we were going over photosynthesis. NADH and FADH2 are other energy carriers like that. Notice that we still use ATP because it is the most efficient of all of the energy carriers and the one we use for walk, talk, think, and blink. So pyruvic acid is converted to citric acid, some carbon dioxide is released, along with 6 ATP and 2 NADH. In the second half of the Krebs cycle, the citric acid is then converted into carbon dioxide again. This time there is no larger molecule, producing 6 NADH, 2 FADH2, and 24 ATP. So if you take a look at this in total, we are looking at 6 ATP plus 24 ATP for a total of 30 ATP produced in the Krebs cycle. Do you guys remember how many we produced in glycolysis? Yeah, 2. And fermentation doesn't produce any ATP. So if you think about that, if you stay out in the cytoplasm and do not have the oxygen to come in here, you're going to only get 2 ATP. If you come into the Krebs cycle, which requires you to go into the mitochondria and have oxygen, now we've already increased that by a huge amount, adding 30 ATP, and we're still not quite done yet. So when we think about this, don't worry about all the individual steps. Think about the differences in terms of net gain of ATP comparing the two systems. And remember, pyruvic acid is that key intermediate. Don't worry about citric acid or exactly how many NADH or things like that we have to deal with. Focus on the pyruvic acid, the ATP, the glucose. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and move on. So this is the Krebs cycle. And when you go ahead and take a look at the Krebs cycle, you have your coenzyme A, your acetyl-CoA. These get complicated. We're not going to go over these. You're not expected to know this. What I want you to know is your 3-carbon pyruvic acid goes through this little spin cycle and starts producing NADH, ATP, and FADH2. All the while picking off carbon dioxide molecules so that we're getting the energy out of all the bonds that are holding all of these things together. This takes place in the mitochondria, which requires oxygen in order to occur. All right. The final stage of cellular respiration is what we call the electron transport chain. And I know you're saying, Kenna, but you already said the electron transport chain was part of the light reactions in photosynthesis. You're right. And this one looks incredibly similar. But in this particular case, we don't have photosystems to go ahead and give the energy to boost the electrons to carry out the electron transport chain. So in this case, we're going to use the energy produced by the Krebs cycle to go ahead and power the electron transport chain. It's going to use those higher energy electrons from the Krebs cycle to convert ADP into ATP, and amazingly enough, it uses the same protein, that facilitated diffusion protein, ATP synthase, to go ahead and do the conversion. Do you remember the one we talked about that works kind of like a water wheel or a turbine of some sort? And it's going to go ahead and manufacture ATP for us. And this process is going to just keep going and start over and over and over again. Now, this also happens inside the mitochondria, and it's going to be inside a plasma membrane, still dealing with our lipid bilayer. Notice, however, that in this particular instance, right here, you do not have a photosystem. Over here, you do not have a photosystem. That energy has to come from somewhere else, not from sunlight. Okay? So when we go ahead and take a look at this process, okay, we've got electron transport. But notice that this time the electrons come from NADH and FADH2, those other electron carriers we talked about in the Krebs cycle. Those go through, and again, they pump hydrogen ions to the inner membrane space, making this side hypertonic. When we look at that hydrogen ion movement, it does not want to be hypertonic. It wants to be what? That's right, isotonic. And as such, they're going to look for a pathway back to the other side. That pathway is through the facilitated diffusion tunnel or channel protein, ATP synthase, which turns like a turbine and goes ahead and converts our ADP into ATP. All right, so we've now gone over all of the stages of cellular respiration. Let's go ahead and see if we can remember them. We begin the process with glucose and oxygen. The first stage of cellular respiration is what? If you said glycolysis, you're right. Do you remember where glycolysis takes place? That's right, in the cytoplasm. Now your body has a big decision to make. Does it have oxygen or does it not? If it doesn't, it's going to stay in the cytoplasm and it's going to go into fermentation. For you guys, remember that's lactic acid fermentation, not alcoholic. But we use alcoholic when we go ahead and do things like bake bread or brew beer. But let's say for this instance, we have the oxygen, all the oxygen we need. We're then going to go on to the next step of cellular respiration, which is what? That's right, the Krebs cycle. And where does the Krebs cycle take place? You're right again. Takes place inside the mitochondria. Once it finishes the Krebs cycle, we have all those electron carriers and a lot of our ATP, and that goes ahead and moves on to what? That's right, the Electron Transport Chain. I also like abbreviating it ETC. So, where does the Electron Transport Chain take place? Very good. It also takes place in the mitochondria, just like the Krebs cycle. So glycolysis is the only one that's not in the mitochondria, instead is in the cytoplasm. And what are the products? What do we manufacture when we go through the chemical reactions that make up cellular respiration? That's right. The products here are the same thing as the reactants in photosynthesis. So this is CO2 and H2O. Now, if you guys exercise a lot, or if you take a nutrition class, or if you take wellness here at Willamette, hopefully these are terms that you recognize. Aerobic and anaerobic. Now, I always thought that it was interesting that we talk about aerobics as a class, right? In aerobics, the goal is to get healthy by doing a bunch of calisthenics and other exercises. But aerobic means in the place of oxygen. And if you're really pushing yourself, you're actually going to get to a point where you don't have enough oxygen. But typical aerobic respiration is going to go into glycolysis, and that's going to go straight into the Krebs cycle with oxygen present so that we can go ahead and finish off in the mitochondria, making the maximum amount of ATP. When you start getting so fast, or if you're so out of shape that it doesn't take that long, when your body runs out of oxygen, we go into what's called anaerobic respiration. So without oxygen, we go into fermentation. Now for us, in humans, that's going into lactic acid fermentation as we stay inside the cytoplasm. And from glycolysis, instead of going into the mitochondria, we go into fermentation. Okay? Now that doesn't produce any more additional ATP. We'll keep doing glycolysis because we do get a net gain of 2 ATP, but that's it. Let's compare that 2 ATP that we get from anaerobic respiration to what we get from full aerobic cellular respiration going into the mitochondria. Now, we already talked about how much we get from glycolysis. There's your net gain of 2. We talked about the production from the Krebs cycle, which is 30. In the electron transport chain, we make 6 more ATP for a net total of 38 ATP. That's far more ATP than the 2 we see from fermentation. So we have 36 more ATP going through cellular respiration as opposed to going ahead and doing simply glycolysis and going into fermentation. That's a big difference. Okay, so I have a table here, and if you're a person like me who finds tables helpful in terms of comparing processes, I think this is a good one to go ahead and include in your notes. In this table, we're going to go ahead and compare aerobic versus anaerobic respiration. You'll notice that on this side, we have our aerobic right here, and on this side over here, we have our anaerobic process. Now, the reason there are 2 parts is the process of anaerobic respiration is different depending on if you're a plant or a yeast or if you're an animal. So hopefully you recognize that this is the one that you go ahead and perform. Okay, but this is aerobic respiration. It happens in both plants and animals. Okay, so aerobic, by definition, aero means with oxygen or with air. And so oxygen is required for aerobic respiration. You'll notice that in both of the anaerobic forms, which is, remember, fermentation. Okay, so maybe I'll put a little subnote here. Fermentation. We don't. Okay, we don't go ahead and use oxygen. It doesn't matter whether you go into aerobic or anaerobic, you always do glycolysis. And where does glycolysis take place? That's right, it takes place in the cytoplasm. All right, so we now know that oxygen is required for aerobic, but not for anaerobic. All of these stages do glycolysis, whether you do aerobic or anaerobic, but notice the difference in ATP production. If you have oxygen, you can make 38 ATP. If you don't have oxygen, you only get 2. Now, this next column I think is valuable to go ahead and look at. When we go ahead and start talking about ATP production, is glucose molecule totally broken down? When we say yes, that means every bond between the carbons is broken, giving us the maximum amount of energy out of that molecule of glucose. Remember that glucose is C6H12O6. That's 6 carbon atoms bonded to each other. We do not break it all the way down in aerobic respiration, either producing an alcohol, ethyl alcohol, or producing lactic acid, both of which have more than 1 carbon in them. So what is the ultimate product that we manufacture? In aerobic respiration, should make no surprise, carbon dioxide and water. We've broken that molecule down as completely as possible. 6 carbons up here, 1 carbon right here. Versus aerobic respiration or fermentation in animals, producing lactic acid, and anaerobic respiration, producing ethanol and carbon dioxide. So you do get a little bit of carbon dioxide here, but it's still not breaking the glucose molecule down all the way. All right, guys. So that's what I've got for you today. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.